Greetings. I am Dr. Graciela Caneiro Livingston, Provost at Nebraska Wesleyan University. I want to welcome you to this year's presentation of Spooky Evenings. We here at Nebraska Wesleyan are excited and proud of this event that brings together scholars, artists, authors, and filmmakers to discuss the topic of horror in its various manifestations across the arts and the humanities. Professor Juan Jose Castaño Marquez and Dr. Matthew Jarvis have been working tirelessly to bring you the best scholarship in the field of horror through this unparalleled digital humanities event. I would like to acknowledge the generous support from the Nebraska Arts Council, Humanities Nebraska, and the Nebraska Cultural Endowment that helps make quality programming like Spooky Evenings possible. Again, welcome and enjoy this presentation of Spooky Evenings.
Tonight on Spooky Evenings, Dr. Scott Bruce of Fordham University presenting his talk entitled Night is the Dead's Domain, The Habits of Restless Souls in Medieval Thought. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my guest this evening, Dr. Scott Bruce. Welcome, sir. You're giving us a talk tonight entitled Night is the Dead's Domain, The Habits of Restless Souls in Medieval Thought. And we are eager for you to lead us into the underworld and take us to unexplored places.
Well, thank you very much. I've been looking forward to this evening's talk, and I'm very, very grateful for the invitation. A few words about myself to begin. I'm a medieval historian who teaches at Fordham University in the Bronx in New York. I specialize in the history of Christian religion and culture in what we call the early Middle Ages, generally between about 400 CE to 1200 CE. And my specific interest is monastic culture. I study monks and particularly interested in their cultural production and the stories that they told. As it turns out, as you'll see this evening, monks told lots of stories about ghosts. And this for me was a very happy coincidence. I studied monks for other reasons, largely because they're very much not like me. Other than my tonsure, I don't have much in common with medieval monks. I'm married, I like to drink wine, I am definitely not celibate. And but they are alluring to me, these people who 1,000 years ago gave up worldly pleasure in order to strive towards an angelic life, to emulate angels, to try and earn their way into heaven while still living on earth. I find them endlessly fascinating. And so lucky me that as someone who was already interested in the supernatural, I found that monks were too. Now, my interest in the supernatural goes back a long way. I would say that I would credit very early viewings of Ray Harryhausen animated films from the 1960s, which I watched on TV as a child in the 70s on rainy Sunday afternoons, things like The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad and Jason and the Argonauts, which feature wonderful animated skeletons. And I thought about those endlessly as a child. And then later on, during college, when I was looking for good outdoor work, I found myself working as a gravedigger in a local cemetery. Again, a job I very much enjoyed, slightly macabre, but still good outdoor work. And this has stuck with me, this interest. And I've always enjoyed a good ghost story. So when the opportunity came to do some work for Penguin Classics and to do some translations for them, doing translations of ancient and medieval ghost stories seemed almost second nature, almost too good to be true. And so the research that went into that project and subsequent projects for Penguin Classics is partly what informs the talk tonight. I'm going to talk about the habits and, dare say, habitats of restless souls in medieval thought in three different parts. We're going to begin with the ancient dead, because medieval people in Europe always look back to Greek and Roman models for how they did most things. And in fact, one of the fascinating things we'll see tonight is when they diverge from those models. It's particularly interesting. So we have to set up, what did the Greeks and Romans think of ghosts? What function did hauntings have? How were these told? How were these stories told? So when a ghost appeared, what did it mean? And where did they live when they weren't otherwise haunting people? So we'll look at the dwellings of the dead in ancient thought to begin with, and then we'll look at medieval ghosts and their habits and habitats. What changes in the medieval period? How are ghosts different for Christian Europeans than they were for pagan Romans and Greeks? And then we'll move on to something completely different, which is that a phenomenon that begins really in the 12th century in the north of England, which is the appearance of what we would now call zombies, animated corpses. So not spirits, incorporeal spirits of the dead, but literal animated corpses that rise from their graves and shamble around and terrorize people. And how are these different from the Roman and early medieval ghosts that we're going to begin with? So, and then I'll have a brief consideration at the very end about how the Reformation changes all of this in the 15th and 16th centuries. The whole landscape of the other world gets rewritten, and ghosts take on a very new meaning in early modern history. It's a lot to cover in the time we have, and in addition to talking about it, I will punctuate many of my points with actual ghost stories from ranging from the 1st century CE all the way up to the 13th century. All right, so let's begin. So when we think about the souls of the dead, I mean, there's nobody in the ancient world, it seems, that didn't believe that human mortal bodies, physical bodies, that when they died, some aspect of your selfhood, your person, your soul, as it were, went on to a different place, left your body upon death, so your mortal remains are left behind, and the soul wanders to the realm of the dead. And it was always depicted as a realm, as a place. It wasn't some random corner. It was an actual place where the dead congregated and lived. Unfortunately for ancient people, they did not have a very nice view of where dead souls went. The realm of the dead had characteristics in common, no matter who was describing it, from Homer all the way up to Roman authors. It is underground. It is located in a dark place. It is not pleasant. It has no comforts. It is dismal. It is grim. And life on earth was infinitely more pleasurable than being dead. We nowadays can have fairly rosy views of what our possible afterlives may be like. Romans and Greeks did not. If you are a great hero, you might go to the Elysium Fields or some other place that is nice, but that was simply for exceptional people. Ordinary people like you and me, we went down to a grim and lightless place. And luckily for us, from Roman literature, we have numerous accounts of what this place was like. And one of my very favorite quotes actually comes from, about this topic, comes from Virgil's poem, The Aeneid, the story of Aeneas, the refugee from Troy, who travels to Italy to found the city of Rome. Well, on the way, and we'll talk about the Aeneid in a couple of minutes, but on the way, he has the occasion to descend into the underworld to talk to some ghosts. And one of the ghosts he talks to is the ghost of the spirit of the great hero Achilles. And Achilles complains about being dead, and he does so in the following words. He says, "No winning words about death to me, shining Odysseus." Actually, this is from the Odyssey. "By God, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt poor tenant farmer who scrounges to keep alive, than rule down hair over all the breathless dead." So this is commonplace in ancient literature where the spirits of the dead are allowed to talk. They complain about their lot. Enjoy your life while you have it, because the afterlife is simply dismal, right? It's no fun at all. But so this is a commonplace. The dead live underground and they live a very grim existence. So why do they appear as ghosts? What makes the spirits of the dead haunt a particular place? Well, in fact, what we're seeing in a haunting, based on some of the sources that we have, is that hauntings occur when the spirit or the soul leaves the dead body and can't make it to that grim, lightless underworld. The ghost doesn't return from the underworld necessarily, it simply hasn't left. It lingers on, attached to our living world for one reason or another. And we know this particularly from ghost stories and the resolutions that ancient authors tell. These are generally didactic stories about how we should treat the dead. Almost every story that you're going to hear tonight has a didactic purpose for the authors involved. Ghost stories were almost never told simply for entertainment value. They may have entertained, but they always had a moral and a purpose. And so the story that I'm about to tell comes from the 1st century, an author that we call Pliny the Younger, to separate him from his uncle, Pliny the Elder, both of whom were authors, and we have numerous of their works. But Pliny the Younger, in particular, was a letter writer. He wrote hundreds of letters that still survive from the late 1st century, early 2nd century. And these concerned all sorts of topics. He wrote letters about dolphins. He wrote letters about the Roman fire brigade. He wrote letters about this upstart new religious sect called Christians. But he also wrote a letter in which he talked about ghost stories and the veracity of ghost stories. And this particular story tells us a great deal about what ancient people thought ghosts were. And so here it is here's part of it from the letter of Pliny the Elder. In Athens, there was a large and spacious mansion that had a reputation for being dangerous to its occupants. In the dead of night, the clanking of iron, and if you listened carefully, the rattle of chains could be heard, some way off at first, and then close at hand. And then there appeared the specter of an old man, emaciated and filthy, with a long flowing beard and hair on end, wearing fetters on his legs and shackles on the chains of his and shackling the chains on his wrists. The wretched occupant would spend fearful nights awake in terror. Lack of sleep led to illness, and then death as dread increased. For even during the day when the apparition had vanished, the memory of it was in their mind's eye, so that their terror remained after the cause of it had gone. The house was therefore deserted, condemned to stand empty, and wholly abandoned to the specter. But it was advertised as being for rent or for sale in case someone was found who knew nothing of its evil reputation. Yes, even ancient people were jerks, right? The philosopher Athenodorus came to Athens and read the notice. His suspicions were aroused when he heard the low price, and the whole story came out on inquiry, but he was nonetheless, in fact, all the more eager to rent the house. When darkness fell, he gave orders that a couch was to be made up for him in the front part of the house, and he asked for his notebooks, a pen, and a lamp. He sent all of his servants to the inner rooms and concentrated his thoughts, eyes, and hands on his writing so that his mind would be occupied and not conjure up the phantom he had heard about, nor other imaginary fears. At first there was nothing but the general silence of the night, and then came the clanking of iron and the dragging of chains. He did not look up or stop writing, but steeled his mind to shut out the sounds. Then the noise grew louder, came nearer, was heard in the doorway, and then inside the room. He looked around, saw, and recognized the ghost described to him. It stood and beckoned as if summoning him. Athenodorus, in his turn, signaled for it to wait a little, and then bent over his notes and his pen, while it stood rattling its chains over his head. He looked around again and saw it beckoning as before, so without further delay, he picked up his lamp and followed. It moved slowly as if weighed down with chains. And when it turned off into the courtyard of the house, it suddenly vanished, leaving him alone. He then picked up some grass and leaves and marked the spot. And the following day, he approached the magistrates and advised them to give orders for the place to be dug up. There they found bones, twisted around with chains, which were left bare and corroded by the fetters when time and the action of the soil had rotted away the flesh. The bones were collected and given a public burial. And after the shades had been duly laid to rest, the house saw them no more. So here we have a wonderful haunted house story almost, it evokes Dickens in the 19th century. You could almost see this being Philip Marlowe with his chains, right? But it's telling us something very important. If you do not treat the dead with respect, if the dead are not given funerary rites and laid to rest, then their spirits will continue to haunt a place and terrorize the inhabitants, unless, in the case of this philosopher, you're able to steal your mind, not be terrified, and figure out the ghost's purpose. So the ghost story in this case is really about how to teach people the proper care of the dead and the consequences if you do not bury the dead and treat them well. Now, this story gives away a cultural aspect about, or an aspect of Roman culture we might not see otherwise, which is in the ancient, now we tend to be, I can say this as a former gravedigger, we tend to be insulated from the dead in our modern world, right? When people get sick and die, they do so in institutions, they do so well away from public sight. And in the ancient world, they did not have the same kind of luxury. Death was everywhere. Dead bodies could be found on the street. In fact, Roman cities hired corpse draggers, people that would walk around with big chains and hooks to remove the bodies of the indigent and throw them into the mass potter's fields or public graves. These people, these corpse draggers, had a kind of social pollution that came along with them because they were constantly in contact with dead bodies. And as a result, they were heavily tattooed and they wore bells. So you would recognize them and not share a cocktail with them at a party. But we're insulated from all that now. We have to remember that in the ancient and medieval world, death was everywhere. It was always with people, and it was always on their minds. So looking after the dead, making sure those bodies were put in the proper place was something hugely important, not just for their mental well-being, but for public health. I mean, it was a real necessity. But as this story tells us, certain kinds of people, at least it insinuates that certain kinds of people, that is, people who died in certain ways, were more susceptible to haunting or to being a ghost than other people. And we'll talk about that again in a second too. Now, ghosts didn't just appear because of hauntings. So if you died poorly, in the case of this person, chained up, perhaps they were a slave, buried with no markers, no funerary rites, then that led to a haunting. Other people, other occupations led to haunting as well. Many ghosts of the ancient world were soldiers, people who died on the battlefield, and again, simply were not buried or were forgotten or were hidden away. And therefore they too would come back as ghosts. But the worst and also the creepiest way that ghosts appeared in the ancient world was through the activity of a necromancer. So the ancient world knew religious specialists, they were called necromancers, they were called witches if they were women, who had the power through magical spells to compel the spirits of the dead to come back from the underworld and to inhabit the corpse in which they had lived. It was an absolutely terrifying thing that the spirit resisted, but if the spells of the religious practitioner were strong enough, they could do so, and then the corpse would speak. This was they often did so in order to get the ghost to tell information, to provide information that the dead might know that the living did not know yet. And the term necromancia in Greek actually means divination by means of speaking to the dead. And so the purpose is that the dead have knowledge that the living do not have. You summon them back to their body. They hate it. They're resistant to it. But nonetheless, you can compel them to speak on the promise that you will then let them go back to the underworld. And we have numerous examples in ancient literature of necromancers at work. One of the most famous of them actually is from Homer's Odyssey, where Odysseus himself, the hero of the story, engages in a necromantic ritual in order to get information about how to get home. You'll recall that the story of Odysseus, he is a refugee from the Trojan War. He's trying to get back to the island of Ithaca. It takes a long time. It takes 10 years because he has done he's committed the mistake of blinding the Cyclops Polyphemus, who is the son of Poseidon, the sea god. And so Poseidon is angry and going to do everything he can to keep Odysseus from getting back home. So when Odysseus ends up on the island of the sorceress Circe, she tells him, listen, in order to get home, you have to go talk to a very famous prophet. His name is Tiresias. The problem is that Tiresias is dead. So you have to go to the underworld. You have to summon, I'll teach you how to do it. You have to summon his spirit. It's a necromantic ritual, and then talk to him and he will tell you how to get home. And so in the Odyssey, we get this incredible story of very detailed of a necromantic ritual performed in the ancient world. Now, for Odysseus, the underworld is not some pit or place underground. He actually goes to a distant shore on in the ocean. It never says exactly where it is in the text. And he comes on shore and then he performs the ritual. And now he's thinking, this is great. I'll perform this ritual. Tiresias will come. I'll talk to him. He'll give me the information. What he's not ready for is the hundreds of ghosts that answer his necromantic summons. And when the author of the Odyssey tells us about these ghosts, he gives away what kind of people are most likely to become ghosts and to be susceptible to necromantic summons. And so here's a little clip from the Odyssey. So here at the spot on the shoreline, Perimedes and Eurylochus, two of his buddies, held the victims fast, and these are sheep that they brought to the shore. And I, Odysseus, drawing my sharp sword from beside my hip, dug a trench of about a forearm's depth and length, and around it I poured libations out to all the dead. Now, I'm not going to say that this is efficacious, and don't try this at home, but it really will make a mess. So listen to how to be careful if you're going to try this, right? So he's dug this trench about a forearm's depth and length, and around it I poured libations out to all the dead, first with milk and honey, and then with mellow wine, and then water third and last. And I sprinkled glistening barley over all of it. And time and again, I vowed to all the dead, to the drifting, listless spirits of their ghosts, that once I returned to Ithaca, I would slaughter a barren heifer in my halls, the best I had, and load a pyre with treasures. And to Tiresias, alone, apart, I would offer a sleek black ram, the pride of all my herds. And once my vows and prayers had evoked the nations of the dead, I took the victims, and over the trench I cut their throats, and the dark blood flowed in, and up out of Erebus they came, flocking toward me now, the ghosts of the dead and gone, brides and unwed youths, and old men who had suffered much, and girls with their tender hearts freshly scarred by sorrow, and great armies of battle dead, stabbed by bronze spears, men of war still wrapped in bloody armor, thousands swarming around the trench from every side. Unearthly cries, blanching terror gripped me. I ordered the men at once to flay the sheep that lay before us, killed by my ruthless blade, and burn them both, and then say prayers to the gods, to the almighty god of death and dread Persephone. And I, the sharp sword drawn from beside my hip, sat down on alert there and never let the ghosts of the shambling, shiftless dead come near that blood till I'd questioned Tiresias myself. So the dead in this episode are voiceless. They have to come and drink the concoction of blood in order to speak. And they clearly have some kind of material component because Odysseus thinks he can keep them at bay with his sword. And yet the great and terrible surprise of this story is one of the ghosts that comes is the ghost of his very own mother. He did not know she had died. And when he talks to her and realizes she died in heartbreak that he did not come home, he moves to hug her. And he tries 3 times and his arms keep passing through him. It's absolutely heartbreaking scene. But it goes to show this weird ambivalence. They seem to be corporeal, and yet because they can drink and they can be warded off with a sword, and yet they're not because his hands passed right through them. The other thing to note in this story, other than the interesting aspect of the ritual itself, is the dead who are susceptible to the call. Young girls with broken hearts. The unspoken thing here is that they've probably committed suicide. They've thrown themselves into a river or gone someplace where their bodies are unrecoverable. The battle dead, all of the dead soldiers whose bodies have not been recovered from the battlefield. So there's this sense that unless you've gone through the proper funerary rites, you may haunt a place, or you're at least much more susceptible to the necromancer summons should someone with those magical arts try and summon you. This is a pretty complicated inheritance for the European Middle Ages, in part because Christianity begins to rewrite some of the rules of what the afterlife is. We see many early Christians talking about the afterlife in very Roman terms, in terms of souls going underground. In fact, even Jesus himself, when he dies, goes down into the earth for 3 days before his resurrection. And early Christians took this quite literally. He went down to subterranean realms and then came back up again. Even in the early 2nd century and into the 3rd century, the Christian authors like Tertullian talked about the dead as living in underground chambers. only the saints went to heaven. And as we'll see in Christian thought, only the very wicked went to hell. And over the course of the early Middle Ages, Christians have to rewrite the geography of the afterlife to include a third place where ordinary sinners like you and me go, people who are not perfect and yet not completely wicked. And this third place, as you know, comes to be known as purgatory, the place of purgation. But it takes a long time for Christians to hammer out what this place is and what it means exactly. And some of the imagery they play with in describing purgatory, some of the imagery that we'll treat tonight. So again, in the Christian view, once we move into the Christian era and into the European Middle Ages, how do they tell ghost stories in a way that, and how do those relate to the Roman stories that came before them? Well, they are similarly didactic. Ghosts return from the dead to teach us things about how we should treat the dead. In the ancient world, it was about how we look after dead bodies and how we treat them in order for them to rest. In the Christian world, rather than ghosts being held over and unable to go to the realm of the dead because their bodies haven't been treated correctly, what we have in the Christian world is that Christians Christian dead souls go to purgatory where they suffer because of and generally they suffer in fire to cleanse them of their sins. And we see the ghosts returning from purgatory to the living to say, please pray for me, please help me out because it's terrible here. And if you offer prayers on my behalf, or if you hire religious specialists like monks to pray on my behalf, I'll get out of here sooner. So this is a very, very common Christian manipulation of the ancient ghost story to press home a new message about the afterlife, about the fate of souls, and about the way human beings can affect that fate through Christian prayer. There are many such stories in the Middle Ages. They're ubiquitous. One of my favorites, because it has an ironic, nasty twist to it, comes from the 12th century, from an abbot named Peter the Venerable, who's the abbot of the monastery of Cluny from 1122 to 1156. Peter was very fond of ghost stories, and this is one that appeared in his collection of miracles, the De Miraculis, about an abbot who comes back from the dead to request prayers. So it's told from the point of view of a monk named Bernard. And as we'll see, Bernard doesn't suffer fools. He's trying to be a good monk. So there was at Cluny a monk named Bernard, concerning whom they say that sometimes in certain circumstances he behaved in a frivolous manner, but once he was corrected, he learned the habit of regular discipline. After he had suffered the disgrace of words as well as the disgrace of blows, he bore his correction with the utmost patience, and after his chastisement, he displayed a mild demeanor as he hastened to whatever task was at hand. So we're set up to take Bernard seriously. One night, while the brethren were celebrating the night vigils with praises to God, Bernard left the choir where he was singing with the others, and he headed to the dormitory, the sleeping quarters of the monks. While he was climbing the stairs, suddenly Stephen, who was commonly called the White, formerly the abbot of the monastery of St. Egidius, who had died a few days before, blocked his way. Bernard did not recognize him at first, and believing him to be someone else, he hastened toward the dormitory. But the ghost of the dead man that had appeared broke the silence with these words, saying, "Where are you going? Stay and hear what I have to say to you." Now Bernard was truly stunned, but also angry that this monk was breaking the rule by speaking at night and in an improper place. And he expressed these words using sign language. The monks of Cluny were so devoted to their discipline of silence that they created a language of gestures to communicate very simple things to one another so they wouldn't have to speak. And this is what Bernard uses to this monk on the stairs. But when the dead abbot, who had returned with the intention of speaking rather than remaining silent, kept on talking, Bernard was compelled by his rebellious actions to stop making signs and to ask him who he was and what he wanted. The abbot said, "I am called Stephen, abbot of St. Egidius, a sinner in many ways, both before my abbacy and thereafter. For these sins I now suffer harsh penalties, from which I can be freed more quickly through the inexpressible mercy of God, if someone assists me. Therefore I pray to you that, moved by my plea, you might beseech the Lord Abbot and all the brethren to pour forth prayers before Almighty God for my freedom, and to do everything that they can to release me from such great evils." And when Bernard responded that he would indeed do what the ghost asked, but feared that no one would ever believe his story, the dead man who was speaking added, "So that no one can have any doubt concerning the things you will tell them, know that 8 days from now you will depart from this life. And after you foretold the time of your own death to them, once it has taken place, your demise will prove that you spoke the truth." And once he said this, he immediately vanished before the monk's eyes. Now, you got to feel bad for poor Bernard here. He does this. He goes and he tells the monks, "I saw a ghost. He said I'm going to die in 8 days." And they all sat around waiting. And sure enough, he died in 8 days. And they're like, "Oh, wow, it's true." And they prayed for the abbot, and he was freed from purgatory. We never learn what happened to Bernard after that. The poor guy. But this is a standard Christian medieval ghost story. Instead of wanting to be buried correctly or to have his, to be laid to rest properly, Christian ghosts almost always return from purgatory to beg for prayers from the monks, to beg for somebody to pay attention to them and to help them make their way to heaven. Because in this new configuration of the afterlife, we said only the truly wicked go to hell, only the saints go directly to heaven, and the rest of us need all the help we can get to get out of that place where we're having our sins burned away from us. Now, the didactic function of these stories continued, and they didn't necessarily always have to be about the supplication for prayers from sinful individuals. Sometimes they were warnings from people who were actually hellbound. And they serve the didactic purpose of don't be like them, avoid the behavior. And this is almost always in the context of sermons. Peter the Venerable's story here was told for monks. It was written for monks and told to monks, and they listened to it. The next two little vignettes I'm going to tell you right now were told to lay people, to people like you and me who showed up in church on Sunday and listened to a monk or a priest preach. These are from the 13th century from an author named Cesarius of Heisterbach, and they both concern hellbound souls who want to teach us how not to follow their example. Noteworthy here too that the individuals in question who are hellbound are not religious figures but secular lay people like you and me. So here's the first one. Not many years have elapsed since the death of a very wealthy official of the Duke of Bavaria. One night, the castle in which his wife was sleeping trembled so much that it seemed as though there was an earthquake. And behold, the door of the chamber in which she was lying opened, and her husband entered, accompanied by a giant figure, blacker than black, who pushed him by the shoulders. And when she saw and recognized her husband, she called him to her and made him sit upon the seat at her bedside. She felt no fear, but as she was only wearing a nightgown, she draped a part of her bed covering over her shoulders, for it was cold. She asked her husband about his condition, and he responded with sadness, "I am consigned to eternal punishment," he said. Hearing this, his wife grew very frightened and said, "What are you saying? Did you not give alms in abundance? Your door was open to every pilgrim. Do these good deeds provide no benefit to you at all?" And he responded, "They provide no advantage at all for eternal life, for I did them out of empty glory rather than out of love." And when she tried to ask him about other things, he answered abruptly, "I was allowed to appear to you, but I can linger here no longer. Behold, my hellish handler stands waiting for me outside. Indeed, if the leaves of every tree turned into tongues, they still could not describe my torments." And after this, he was summoned and driven away. The entire castle trembled as before at his departure, and his lamenting cries echoed for a long time. So here's a lesson about being genuine in your almsgiving, in your charity. And if you do it for glory, then even though you act as though you're virtuous, you're going to hell. The next one is maybe even closer to some of our hearts because it involves a drinker and the dangers of alcohol. Forgive me. Seem to have lost my place. Forgive me 1 second. This one is very short. So, in the Diocese of Cologne, not far from the city of Cologne, there was a certain knight by the name of Rudinger. He was so entirely given over to wine that he would attend celebrations at different county estates for the sole purpose of drinking. And when he became ill and was about to die, his daughter asked him to appear to her within 30 days. Responding, "I will do it if I can," he died. And indeed, after his death, he appeared to his daughter in a vision. "Behold, I'm here, just as you asked. And in his hand, he was carrying a small clay cup with which he used to drink in taverns. And his daughter asked him, Father, what is in the cup? And he responded, my drink is made from pitch and sulfur. I'm always drinking from it, and I cannot empty it. And then he disappeared. And immediately the girl understood, as much from his previous life as from his punishment, that there was little or no hope in his salvation. For in the here and now, wine goes down easily, but in the end, it will bite you like a snake. So again, another pithy, didactic, memorable story to teach lay people from the pulpit how they should behave. And this is the primary purpose of ghosts in medieval Christian thought, at least as told by the religious specialists. Now, the last part of the talk, I have to turn to something much more uncanny and much more difficult to explain. In fact, ancient medieval authors in describing this phenomenon said it was unprecedented, which is very unusual because medieval people almost always liked to beckon to the authority of tradition when they talked about things. They could tell ghost stories in part because everybody was familiar with ghosts because everyone had always been telling ghost stories. The stories they told about risen corpses were unprecedented in the Western tradition. Romans don't tell stories like this, nor do Greeks. They inherited, medieval Christians inherited no stories like this. So they even go so far as to say the ancient authors told no such tales. This is something new and frightening to us. And so we're left to wonder what on earth was going on beginning in England in the late 12th century when the first reports of risen corpses began. Medieval people called these creatures many different things. They referred to them as what we call revenants. They called them monsters. They didn't have a word for zombies. You will recognize them as such, though. And they gave they shared several ideas about what they thought these creatures were and what they meant. But the stories they told, these were, again, they tended to be stories told by historians, people writing about what was happening in their time and not necessarily by monastic authors. And they were sometimes given a religious significance and sometimes not. But I have to encapsulate one or two things for you, because if you're going to come away with anything from my talk tonight, you should really know what to do when you're confronted by a medieval walking corpse. So corpses rose from the dead, at least according to medieval authors, either because the life force of the individual was so bad that it was being punished by God. The soul was being punished by being put back in its body and then ambling around and doing all sorts of terrible things. But we're left to wonder why God would punish everyone in the vicinity too, because as you'll see, these things are quite a menace. Or they were simply dead bodies that Satan himself had animated, or demons had animated to serve as their instruments of chaos. And while I've presented them to you in corporeal terms, some of the stories actually talk about them changing shape. So they would rise from the dead and then they would appear as bears or dogs or birds even, and then return back to the form of the rotting corpse that was wandering around. They almost always had a kind of pestilent breath. Their breath caused disease, and so you didn't want to get anywhere near them. They were almost always attracted to people who they knew in life, especially spouses. They were always men. So women, ladies, be careful who you choose to marry, because they always came back to their wives to bother them. And there were certain things you could do to get rid of them. The main thing was you had to find the body when it was not animate, and you had to chop it up, especially cut off its head or tear out its heart and burn it. So write that down in case it happens to you. But this, of course, required a considerable amount of bravery. and some of these people, as you'll see from the stories I'm about to relate, were up to the challenge. One of the remarkable things is we could say, okay, sure, the cutting off of the heads of individuals who rose from the dead, this is what storytellers say. But there's a fair amount of archaeological evidence, especially from Anglo-Saxon England, that some people did go to great lengths to make sure bodies would not rise again. And so we know of bodies from archaeological excavations where the heads had been already cut off, kind of preemptively cut off, perhaps because the person was considered to be particularly wicked. Even more ingenious are bodies that are buried face down. So if the body reanimates, hypothetically, it's going the wrong way, right? It's going to claw its way down instead of clawing its way up. So it's very difficult to actually interpret the cultural meaning of archaeological remains, but those are pretty compelling hypotheses as to why the dead were treated unusually in those ways. So the first of these stories comes from William of Newburgh, who was writing at the end of the 12th century in the north of England. And again, he relates a story about a restless corpse of a particularly nasty individual. In fact, we know a little bit about this guy. Well, he tells us a little bit about this guy. And he goes by the name of the Hound Priest, the Hundepriest, because he was in life, he was a religious figure who was deeply attached to worldly pursuits, including hunting, for which he used dogs. So this may be one reason why he came back from the dead. A few years ago, William tells us, the chaplain of a certain noble lady died and received burial at that noble monastery called Melrose, which is now on the Scottish borderlands of England. This man had very little respect for the sacred order to which he belonged, and he acted very much like a layman. What especially blackened his reputation as a minister of the Holy Sacrament was his dedication to the vanity of hunting, with the result that he was known to many by the notorious nickname Hundeprest, that is, the Hound Priest. And indeed, while he was alive, this preoccupation of his was alternately ridiculed by people, or thought to be a refined pastime. But it was only after his death that the guilt deriving from it became clear, for he rose from his grave at night. He was unable to sow terror or cause harm in the monastery itself due to the merits of the holy monks who lived there. But after that, he wandered around outside the abbey and carried on with great groans and a hideous murmuring, particularly around the bedchamber of his former mistress. After this had happened a few times, she became very anxious and shared the enormity of her fear and the sense of danger with one of the monks who visited her concerning an affair related to the abbey. She demanded with tears that prayers more earnest than usual be poured forth on her behalf, as though for one suffering in agony. The monk sympathized graciously and with good reason for her anxiety, for she seemed most deserving of numerous prayers from the holy community of that place, and he promised a prompt remedy through the mercy of the highest provider, that is God. Now, the monk returned to the abbey and joined forces with another monk of the same age and temperament and two strong young men, with whom he kept watch over the cemetery where that wretched priest lay buried. These 4 men, furnished with weapons and bravery, spent the night in that place, safe in the support that they provided for one another. Midnight had just passed, and no sign of the monster had appeared. And then it happened that 3 of them, leaving alone in that place the one who had brought them all together, went to a nearby house, as they explained, to ward off the chill of the night with a fire. Leaving the one guy alone, of course. Then, when this monk found himself alone in that place, the devil, believing that he'd found the right moment to break the monk's courage, roused his vessel, which had seemed to have lain quiet longer than usual. Seeing the monster from a distance, at first the monk grew stiff with fear, for he was alone, but he soon recovered his courage. And when it was clear that there was no place to run, he valiantly intercepted the onslaught of the horror, which rushed toward him with a terrible roar, and he buried the battle axe he was wielding deep into its body. When it received this wound, the monster let out a cry and, turning its back, fled away, though not quite as quickly as it advanced. The amazing monk harried this fleeing foe from behind and forced it back into its own tomb, which gaped open for the monster on its own accord. Once it had snatched its guest from the sight of its pursuer, the tomb appeared to close right away with the same ease. And when these events were taking place, the companions who had sought relief from the night's chill near the fire left the house and ran late to the scene. When they heard what had happened, at dawn they assisted in digging up that cursed corpse and dragging it away from the tomb. And once they'd cleansed the monster of all the dirt that came out with it, they found on its body the great wound that it had received, and in the tomb a large amount of gore which had flowed from it. And so they carried the corpse beyond the walls of the abbey for burning and scattered the ashes. I've told this story in plain language, exactly as I heard it myself from devout men. So here is a monk or several monks taking matters into their own hands and using what we might call a folk remedy to rid themselves of this menace. We don't see prayers for the dead. We don't see absolution for the soul of the corpse. We see a very hands-on method, as we might say, of dealing with a body that has risen from the dead. Another revenant story from exactly the same time by a gentleman named Walter Mapp conveys the fate, and this will be my last story of the evening, conveys the fate of 2 peasants who lived on the land of an abbey, and they no longer wanted to serve the abbot, even though they were entitled to. And so they took up and left and began to serve the local count, the local secular lord, deciding they would be his vassals instead. They had no right to do so. And moreover, they spoke ill of the abbot, and they roused the count to take armed action against the abbey and to try and take some of the abbey's lands. Now, medieval abbeys are often protected, not necessarily directly by God himself, but by the saints whose bones are kept in the altar. And in this case, the count came up against the wrath of the saint who was at this particular abbey. Her name was Modwena. She was a Welsh saint. And Modwena took out her wrath particularly on these two peasants who spoke ill of the monastery and cursed them. And as a result, they too rose from the dead thanks to the power of the vengeful power of the saint. So the evening of the very next day, the two fugitive peasants, through whom and because of whom this whole evil affair had begun, were sitting down to eat when both of them were suddenly struck down dead. On the very next evening, both of them were laid in wooden coffins and buried in the churchyard at Stapen Hill, the village from which they had both fled. What followed was exceedingly strange and especially astounding. On the same day on which they were buried, they appeared at dusk, while there was still a hint of light, at Drakelow, a nearby village, carrying upon their shoulders the wooden coffins in which they were buried. And through the next day, they wandered through the paths of the village and the nearby fields, sometimes in the form of men carrying wooden coffins on their shoulders, sometimes in the likeness of bears or dogs or other kinds of animals. And moreover, they spoke to the other peasants, banging on the walls of their homes and crying out to everyone who could hear, "Get moving, quickly, get moving, get up and come with us." When these uncanny events had repeated themselves every evening and every night for quite some time, a disease struck the village, and all the peasants living there suddenly found themselves in such a dire situation that within 3 days, with the exception of 3 individuals, of whom we'll talk later, every last one of them succumbed to sudden death in the strangest way. So needless to say, the count freaks out. He goes to the abbot, he makes amends, he pays back double what he took from the abbey because he'd stolen a bunch of their grain, and he boots it out of town. He was done, right? But that still left the locals with these walking corpses to deal with. They lived in fear of the dead men, whose phantoms had carried their wooden coffins on their shoulders in the evening and at night, as we described above. With the permission of the bishop, the monks sought out the graves of these people, dug them up, and found their bodies intact, but the linen wrappings over their face were stained with gore. They cut off the heads of the corpses and placed them between their legs in the graves, and then they ripped the hearts out of their bodies, which they buried once more in the earth. They carried their hearts to a place where they burned them from morning until evening. And finally, once the hearts had been burned, they cracked open with a great sound as though due to immense pressure. And suddenly everyone there clearly saw an evil spirit in the shape of a crow flying from the flames. Soon after these things occurred, the deathly sickness and the phantoms disappeared once and for all. And the peasants, the last surviving peasants who were sick, got well, but everyone abandoned the village thereafter, and to the day of the writing of it, it remained abandoned. So I kind of love the fact that, well, many of the ghost stories from medieval Europe that we have follow a certain kind of logic. They have a didactic purpose. Ghosts come from a certain place with a certain need and can be laid to rest. These particular stories about revenants, which are unique to the north of Europe in the 12th and 13th century, are mysterious, and they did not fall within the otherworldly logic of medieval thinkers, and they make for very good stories. And that might be why they stuck around. But no one has ever adequately explained, either medieval or modern, why these events were happening. Now, as a coda to the talk, by way of conclusion, the Reformation of the 15th century challenged the otherworldly views of medieval Catholics. Protestant reformers vehemently denied the existence of purgatory, in part because it had no scriptural precedent. There's nowhere in the Bible that talks about a third place where souls are cleansed before they get into heaven. It's part of medieval tradition. And because the papacy and the church at large would charge money for indulgences, so people would pay in order for the papacy to use their power to get people out of purgatory. Luther and other reformers thought this was absurd, and that the church grew wealthy on this because of the fears that they instilled in people about the fate of souls. So the Protestants did away with the idea of purgatory altogether, and in doing so, they were faced with the question of where ghosts come from. Will they believe in ghosts? What does a good Protestant say in the 15th century when confronted with a ghost? And Protestant thinkers, we see them spilling a lot of ink about this because belief in ghosts were widespread. But what they went on to say was, in fact, 99% of the time when you see a ghost, it is actually a demon in disguise. It is a demon taking the form of a dead person in order to deceive you. And perhaps 1% of the time, it is an angel. It might be a good spirit who's trying to help you out, again, in the form of a dead person. And where we see this tension beautifully and very succinctly is in Shakespeare's Hamlet. When Hamlet first confronts, in the first act of the play, confronts his father, the ghost of his father, on the ramparts of the castle, his first response, and Hamlet, we know, is a good Protestant. It actually signals this at the beginning of the play by saying he went to Wittenberg for university, Wittenberg being the city where Martin Luther hung up his 95 Theses against the church. So they're signaling there that he's Protestant in character, but he gives it away entirely because when he's confronted with his father's ghost, he says, "What are you? Are you a goblin damned or an angel of light or a creature of light?" And there's only two things he could be. He could be a devil, right? Or he could be an angel. There's no sense from Hamlet that this is a ghost that has returned from a place called purgatory. Now, not so for his father, who in fact is a ghost who's returned from purgatory, and a very Catholic ghost at that. And part of Hamlet's problem is that he's wrestling with this anxiety that's caused when you take purgatory away. What happens to a man like his father who who was murdered before he could confess his sins in Protestant theology? More than likely, he goes to hell. In Catholic theology, he has a chance because he goes to purgatory. He still has a chance of getting into heaven. And part of Hamlet's great discomfort in that play is that he's trying to reconcile these two very conflicting views about what the afterlife is on the matter of his encounter with a ghost. Well, thank you so much for listening for this long. I hope you've enjoyed these pre-modern ghost stories as much as I've enjoyed, obviously, telling them with great relish. And I look forward to any questions. And please do reach out to me if you would like. My website is www.medievalimagination.com. And you can send me email through that website and see what else I'm up to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It is interesting, too, in Hamlet, that he does not kill Claudius at prayer either, lest he be sent directly to heaven.
Indeed. Yeah, there's a very, it's a very sharp dichotomy there. It's the heaven and hell dichotomy. And you begin to understand when you see how tormented Hamlet is, why there was a psychological need, a spiritual need for a place like purgatory to give us hope in what we might obtain when we really are not equipped to obtain it. If we were just given the choice of one or the other, being saints or sinners. Most of us will be sinners.
I mean, it's also funny too, because you mentioned Wittenberg, and the other famous person to go to university from the world of theater who went to the University of Wittenberg, of course, is Dr. Faustus.
Yes.
And he does quite other different types of, I don't think it's necromancy. I mean, Lucifer never dies, so, but he is raised with Mephistopheles, and I mean, he does raise Helen of Troy at the end of the play in the Marlowe version.
Yeah, the medieval. It's fascinating you mentioned that, because the notion that universities are a place where you learn secret knowledge and sometimes dangerous knowledge goes back to the earliest universities in the 12th and 13th century, mainly in the 13th century, and where monastic communities had to decide, were their monks good to go to university? Would we send these young men off to the city to go and train? And they would often live in their own houses and things like that. But we know that many of them encountered magic for the first time, and magic spells, magic books, and including necromantic books at university, and sometimes even brought manuscripts of these kind of things home with them. There's certainly in Canterbury, the work of Sophie Page has a wonderful book called Magic in the Cloister about knowledge of magic among 13th century monks, which they primarily picked up at university. So it's no surprise to me that Faust would be dabbling in these things. It's a medieval tradition that you go to university to learn for things that are forbidden at home.
Well, I mean, Bram Stoker has Dracula go to the Charlemagne, where he learns necromantic alchemy, whatever that means.
That wasn't a major where I went to school, but it sounds pretty cool.
No, I mean, geez, I feel neglected. I know that Berkeley did a PhD in parapsychology, but I feel like I missed something. But of course, the Charlemagne, right? The devil claims one of 3 students each year. Which is
those are not
a fascinating concept. Not good odds, really. I mean, I think my PhD had slightly better odds than that. But yeah, I mean, in Faustus, the Marlowe version, at least, not the Goethe version, you do see this strange relationship to the summoning ritual, right? Faust obviously squanders all the power he obtains from the devil, but at the very last moments of his life, it is interesting that he chooses to sort of like encompass your talk here. This medieval figure bordering on the Enlightenment raises an ancient Greek spirit in the guise of Helen.
No, it's a wonderful that speaks to so many of the traditions we talked about tonight. It's true.
So I want to, I guess, start in terms of I have my notes here, by the way, monk Ghostbusters. Because I had actually, before you mentioned him, had written down Walter Map and the Bishop of Hereford. Sort of wondering if that's where you were going when you were
yes, indeed.
So I was wondering, because the other thing you get in this time period in religious thought is the idea of ethereal beings, and even the idea that Jesus himself is an ethereal being. And I just wondered how they tie together, or if these like, because the reason Jesus needs to be an ethereal being, right, is because the earth is so corrupting that he can't come into physical contact with it. And I'm wondering if there's a tie-in there between that type of religious thought.
Well, that's a good question, and I don't see that so much in monastic discourse. Although it's fascinating to me that in the Gospels themselves, when Jesus walks on the water, the episode where he stays on land and he sends his apostles out in this on a boat into the lake, and then he walks out to join them. When Peter first sees him, he says it's a ghost, and thinks that he must be the spirit of Jesus or some kind of apparition of Jesus walking on the water, until Jesus says, "No, settle down, it's me. Come on out." and we know where that goes. But so there is a sense that his otherworldly activity is at first seen as being spectral, as being possible only to a creature that is spirit and not flesh. But my monks were in certainly in the 12th and 13th century, were quite caught up, and actually maybe not even caught up is probably not the word. They had long since accepted this kind of dual notion of Christ as being God and man at the same time, and were quite reconciled to his earthliness by my period. They were more beginning starting in the 11th century and peaking in the 13th century to considering the kind of what we might call the spiritual and miraculous nature of the Eucharist. That was what was primarily on their mind, as it went from just a commemorative meal with bread to being an actual transfiguration, transubstantiation, where the substance of the bread actually changed to the body and blood of Christ. They had long ago reconciled themselves to his contradictory nature as a person, I think.
How did they reckon? I mean, how do they take, I guess, the story of Lazarus in relationship to this?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's a very good one. And actually, Lazarus is a great story because it reminds us just how insulated we are from the processes of death and decay. Because when Lazarus rises, he really does, they emphasize the fact that he is decaying. The stench from the tomb brings tears to the eyes of the people who are around. And so, but the gospel account is so laconic that we don't get a description that, a full-on description of, was he a decayed corpse that was rapidly revivifying? Did he, did we witness that process, or did he kind of miraculously change? And they didn't spend a long time at least in the biblical commentaries that I know, they didn't spend a long time thinking about it, unfortunately. And they also had a very, it was widely depicted in early Christian art, but always just a static figure of, a tomb, a kind of a house tomb, and then a figure that looked like a little mummy in swaddling cloth standing, almost like a little swaddled baby, almost standing in the doorway of the tomb. And they didn't really go into great depth as to the kind of material, the kind of physicality of his body. Unfortunately, that would have been cool.
So he could be like horrifying, right? He could be like still decomposed but alive.
Absolutely. I mean, it's amazing that nobody has kind of tapped into that, but they studiously avoided that
that's interesting.
For good reason, because because as I mentioned earlier in the talk, that dead bodies were considered to be so polluting in a very real kind of health sense, and then also in a social sense, and so. The ability of Christ to conquer death and everything attendant with death, including bodily decay, was considered to be so miraculous because that whole process was so disgusting and so abhorrent that people had to witness and smell. And I mean, as a former gravedigger, I can tell you, bodies smell. And because there were various instances where we were digging where we hit bodies,
right?
And so it was a regular feature of, regular part of my day. And you just don't have that experience in the day-to-day world now. It's much more common in the ancient world. And something, I don't know if we're losing out, but we're certainly not experiencing it the same way they did.
So,
I'm certainly not going to say I would prefer it. But
one thing we talked about last night with Brandon Graffius was two different types of magic. The magic that comes from God and the magic that comes from somewhere else that is forbidden. And it is interesting because in the terms of the story told with the Walter map particularly, it does seem to be a godly based magic, but it does create this sort of like horrific creature or creatures, I should say, because I believe also that they have to, in that story, they had to coat the shovels with holy water, right?
Yeah, that's yet another story of that's yet another reference story where there's a mingling of a kind of I don't want to it diminishes it in a sense to call it a folk remedy or a folk whatever, but I'll just say the local pragmatic remedies mixed at times with what we would call clerical remedies. And certainly a little holy water doesn't hurt in those instances. But yeah, I think the difference between the two different types of magic that you're talking about is really about agencies. What magic is identifiable as, or what extra normal activity is recognizable as being directed by God or the saints, and what we would call a miracle. And what has an agency that we can't explain, or an agency that is clearly diabolical. Those monks, those 13th century monks I was talking about, who brought home manuscripts containing magical spells and things like that to Canterbury, they studiously avoided any works that involved the summoning of demons, because they're clearly, the agency is diabolical. But they were happy to work with astral magic, with different kinds of magic that had to do with the position of the moon, the position of the stars, because they saw all that as being governed by God. So anything that involved reading nature as was in a sense tapping into God's creation and the divine plan that lay behind it, and so therefore it was acceptable, even if it wasn't church teaching.
It's so interesting because the example you gave, right, is a female specter that creates these. I mean, more what I would think of as necromancy. I understand that necromancy is the divination process, but like if you sort of like think in a 20th century, 21st century way, you think of necromancy as raising the dead for various nefarious purposes. It's interesting because typically you would think of that as being witchcraft centered, particularly in the 13th or 12th century, because it is a woman doing it.
Indeed, in that case, it was fortunately. I mean, her power came from her sanctity, There are many other, because Modwina was a virgin and her bones were there, and so they knew it was her protecting. Although what it's clear in that story that those peasants who are basically cursed to return from the dead are using their voices in a bad way and spreading a pestilence in the same way that in life their sin involved speaking ill of the monastery and the saint. What's unclear to me in that story is why the villagers are subject to them and they're victims, because isn't the saint then indirectly harming all those people, and why were they to blame? So there's part of the logic of that story that's a little mystifying. And we certainly have, it's a whole other topic, but we certainly have from the 10th century onwards, lots of discourse in clerical circles about witches and about women who are practicing various arts, and which is utterly, for the male-dominated church, utterly forbidden. Simply the agency of women makes them uncomfortable, and they're very, very quick to assign that agency to diabolical causes. But that's a whole other topic. Maybe next year.
It makes me think too, when you're talking about her and you were talking about revenant things, it's the concept of the incorruptible also crept into my mind in relationship to this, because isn't that also just another type of revenant?
Yeah, well, there's two ways to answer that. From my experience, one is that yes, indeed, that one of the proofs of sanctity for the bodies of saints is that you dig them up and they are uncorrupted. They are as they were when they died. And also they smell good. They smell like lilies and roses and all this kind of stuff. And yet that is kind of weird, right? That is kind of, they're not dead, right? They don't seem to be dead. And my experience as someone who's worked in the funerary industry is that the modern equivalent of that is embalming. Because in many instances where I had to deal with long dead bodies that were buried, that I had to uncover or dig up, exhume, or just ran into in the course of my daily digging, they were decayed and rotten, and there was something natural to that, right? There's and after a while they're just bones, and that's as it should be. But when you embalm somebody, you in effect pump them full of chemicals, and they become kind of weird spongy mannequins of who they once were. And the flesh doesn't go away because it's filled with a chemical solution, so that when you inadvertently run into it with your shovel, it's like cutting into one of those like one of those foam noodles you would use at the pool. And there's a sense in which you have created this thing that is not going away anytime soon, and all for the purpose of, I presume, a kind of vanity that you don't want the corpse to decay, to undergo the natural processes. I've never read a cultural history of embalming, but somebody should write it as to why this is even remotely appealing. Because all you're doing is stopping all those processes that should naturally occur. But again, that's another topic.
Yeah. It is interesting though, because you think another juxtaposition here between the medieval and the ancient would be the incorruptible and the actuality of an oracle, right? The sort of like comatose virginal female who is obviously drugged and inhaling gaseous fumes and things to have these visions. But there seems to be a sense of parallel between the two, and the idea of divination and also death or living death.
Yeah, there's certainly a sense of some kind of stasis in which or during which the person becomes something else, and that something else also is granted a kind of authority. In the case of an oracle, they have to stop being living, dynamic, frail people and become somehow the mouth of the deity, in a way that but there's a stillness that's a stillness of their human qualities that's implied in that.
That's the same with the saint, right? You become this other thing that people take pilgrimages to that can cure them, that the church is founded on. So it's the same for like vessel through which
indeed, like when you and I die, Yeah, I don't know what your Matthew. When I die,
I'm here forever, right at this desk,
the inert remains. My remains will be inert. But in the medieval worldview, the bones of the saints are, they become, transmitters to God. They're like, it's that line from, the Raiders of the Lost Ark about the Ark of the Covenant. It's the same, applies to saints' bones. Is, they become potent. They become, they're almost throbbing with a divine power that is ready to express itself in the form of miracles that take place around the tomb, and very, very different from the inert remains of ordinary folks.
Are you a Blackadder fan?
It's funny. I am a Canadian, so Blackadder was constantly on TV back home with Monty Python and all the other stuff. But I never watched it. I'm sorry to say.
There's one episode you need to watch, just one. It's from the first season, and it's when Blackadder becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Oh.
And the reason you need to watch it, there's a bunch of stuff about Saints relics and it stuff, but the better reason I feel like you need to watch it is because he's talking about heaven and hell to this guy who's dying, and he basically, because his father is the king, and his father's keeps killing the archbishops because they keep leaving. People keep leaving their lands to the church instead of the crown, and he wants this guy to leave his land to the crown so he doesn't get killed. And he's like, well, heaven's for people who like heavenly things, like watering potted plants and talking to God. So, I think you would enjoy that.
Thank you for the recommendation. I'll look it up for sure.
To get more apocryphalic, but at one point textual to the Bible, the idea of the harrowing of hell came to mind too when you talk about Jesus descending into sort of like the earth. I'm wondering, because I don't know this, when that story gets taken out, when it gets expurgated into the Apocrypha, and why?
So it is. So the story originally appears in it's very old. It's originally appears in Greek, probably 4th century, if not a little earlier, and it gets translated into a myriad of languages. I know the Latin tradition fairly well because I translated it for my Penguin Book of Hell, and I've always been fascinated by the story. I've been fascinated with the image of Pilate, and because it gets wrapped up with another story called the Acts of Pilate about what happens to Pilate, and but the harrowing of hell is it underscores many of the themes that we've talked about today, where Christ, it's a descent. He goes down to the underworld. Who is in this underworld? Well, it's all the Hebrew patriarchs. But the Christians were left with the dilemma of what do you do with everyone who died before Christ's coming? The bad luck of history that they lived before the time when they could actually be saved. And then what do you especially do with those people who predated Christ, who were actually virtuous, who you consider to be virtuous, like the patriarchs of the Hebrew tradition? And so this story attempts to reconcile that by putting them all in hell, some place underground, and then having Jesus during his 3-day sojourn underground come and rescue them by trampling the gates and booting out Hades, who is personified as an individual, and taking Adam and Eve and all the other patriarchs and leading them away. Later Christian thinkers would create a whole separate space in the afterlife called the limbo of the patriarchs, where these people allegedly lived because they didn't actually want to consign them to hell, because by the Middle Ages, hell was considered a very bad place. So they went to a separate limbo, little antechamber all their own, while they waited for Christ to come. So it's a murky. The cartography of that story is very murky because they haven't really worked it out yet. And really what it is it's a way for them, the purpose of the story is a way for them to reconcile the fate of those virtuous heroes who lived before Jesus ever came. Yeah, sorry, that's I may have strayed from your original point. I'm sorry.
No. It's interesting because the other to me, you talked about the Odysseus story, but to me, the ancient story of descending into the underworld, I always think of Orpheus and Eurydice, of course, because I'm also a huge fan of the film Black Orpheus. Which, if you're unfamiliar, is the story of Orpheus and Eurydice set in Brazil during Carnival. Um,
I saw it in college, which was almost medieval, like ago. So yeah, it's a long time ago.
but yeah, I'm a huge fan of that sort of like that narrative, and I mean, it's also interesting in that one too, because in that story we get the idea of the underworld as also emotionless.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I mean, you brought up the wonderful point of like you need to drink blood to speak in the underworld, which also isn't the case for Orpheus because he's enchanted by Apollo. But you know, the idea that to make someone feel emotion in the underworld, because I mean the other piece that was missing for me tonight in terms of like a bridge, I guess, was Sheol, which I Sheol.
Oh yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, which is, well, again, I'm not an expert in the Jewish tradition at all, but but of course Christians, medieval Christians are reading their Hebrew scriptures, which they call the Old Testament, and they're encountering that word, and they're encountering the word Gehenna quite a bit, both of which appear in the Hebrew scriptures, and trying to figure out what to do with them. and then, you know, whereas Sheol just, you know, means a pit or a depression, of a place where a low place where bodies go. And Gehenna is a reference to a valley outside of Jerusalem where the ancient Israelites allegedly performed child sacrifice and was considered to be an unholy place. But they both just get elided to the Christian hell. I mean, this is what it comes down to in the end. They're two. The original meanings of those words are lost in time, and they are too nuanced for Christians to try and explain. And so they just all get amalgamated into, you know, the infernal regions because they're down below. Yeah, so they don't come up in the I don't know as much about them in their original.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's a better through line between sort of the Orpheus version of the myth of the underworld, Sheol, and Purgatory. I'm wondering if there's a.
Oh yeah, that would be it could well be. I'm not expert enough on those things to be able to draw the connection.
That's fair.
But it would be a wonderful thing to do. Oh, you just raised something else for me now. I've forgotten. Oh yeah, so yeah, one of the most astounding texts that I've read in relation to this is a poem that was written by a late Roman poet named Claudian, who's writing in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, and he writes an unfinished epic on the rape of Proserpina. So, you know, the snatching of Proserpina and taking her down to the underworld. And when the god of the underworld is trying to explain to her that it's all going to be okay, you know, he characterizes his world. He says in Latin, you know, we have our own stars and we have our own sky. And it was just hugely evocative to me when I read that, because we tend to think of this dark, you know, kind of cramped place. And he presents it as a place that with a star-filled sky, yet stars that are different than ours. And in that, I think Claudian is unique in the tradition of describing the underworld to do it in that way. And it may have all been a lie to make her feel better, but still, it was wonderful to hear a kind of ancient author break the mold to do something poetic with, and to create put almost some light and color on a palette that's normally very grim.
In terms of the idea of necromancy itself in the ancient world, you mentioned spirits resisting, and I was wondering if there's like an epic sort of like singularity of that we can draw from. You mean like an example like that? Yeah. The big one is from Lucan's Civil War in the 1st century CE. Lucan, an epic poet who's writing, I think it's 9 books of the war between Pompey and Julius Caesar. So he's writing in the early empire, long after the Civil War that ends the Republic. And it's during the process of this war that Pompey's son seeks out a necromancer, a witch named Erichtho, who lives in, I think it takes place in Greece. And she's the one who summons the ghost of a soldier to come, a dead soldier, freshly dead, to come back and inhabit its own body, and then to ask it questions about the outcome of the war.
Pompey's son is not happy with what he learns because he learns his father will be killed and they will lose. But it's that story that is particularly evocative, and medieval monks continued to copy Lucan throughout the Middle Ages and continued to read that necromantic account. What they made of it, I don't know. Nobody ever sat down and said, oh my God, what's going on here? But monks had their own biblical source of necromancy, which was the Witch of Endor, who summons the ghost of Samuel, if I'm getting the story correct. Because I think it's King Saul who, am I getting this right?
We talked about this last evening. So
did you? Okay, yes. I didn't review this before we started. I can't remember now. But the king who wants to summon the ghost of his old advisor because he's about to fight against the Philistines and he wants to hear how the battle's going to go. And so this even though necromancy is forbidden in his realm, he secretly goes and visits a necromancer, and she summons the ghost of this religious figure who is his advisor, and he's like, no, things are going to go badly for you. But so Christians went and looked at that. Christians continued to read the scriptures and see that as a kind of authoritative account of how necromancy works. It was not a good example, but they didn't have to read the Odyssey, and in fact they didn't in the Middle Ages. The Odyssey was never fully translated into Latin. It was just kind of paraphrased, and that necromantic part was left out. So their main way to thinking about necromancy was the Witch of Endor. From the Hebrew Scriptures.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I'm going to suggest that we, like revenants, need to return tomorrow night. I invite everybody to tune in tomorrow night. We have an interview with film director Anna Biller, followed by a screening of her film, The Love Witch. I also invite you to take the survey that Juan is dropping into the various chats at this time. I do want to give a programming note for tomorrow. We will only be screening the film on Twitch, lest we have more gremlins come from the darkness and attack us for copyright reasons, even though we have paid for the rights. So I want to thank my guest again tonight, Dr. Scott Bruce, for joining me. And I want to tell everybody out there to stay spooky.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. It is interesting, these ties, right, with how you sort of like get around ancient necromancy and how it evolves, really, because it's interesting to me how much more corporal it becomes.
Indeed. Yes, no, indeed. It used to be about spirits, like really about summoning spirits, and then it really becomes about animating the dead. And I hope that sufficed tonight. I hope it was what you wanted. And
no, it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. It actually was a great building block off of 2 or 3 other people. So
great.
That's always nice.
And I don't ask this out of vanity, only out of curiosity, but did we have a good audience?
We did.
Excellent.
Yeah, it really builds off the talk that we had with Lawrence Rickles, and also last night with Brandon Grafius. So it's a good 3-parter almost in terms of
great.
Ideas around the undead, and also how one creates an undead.
Wonderful. And I'm correct that you have, is it Henry Ansgar Kelly who's going to be coming in a?
Yes.
Yes, I will be in the audience for that one.
I'm looking forward to it. Right over my shoulder, actually. If I move the right way, you can see the biography of Satan right over my shoulder.
Yeah.
Which is a great title.
Indeed.
It's one of those ones that you take and it's yours and nobody else can get near it, right? It's Satan, a biography. I mean, geez, it's hard to beat.
It's true. Well, Matthew, thank you so very much for inviting me. I really enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Juan's about to pop on